In this opening chapter, we dive into the 99% mindset trap, the invisible mental patterns, habits, and beliefs that keep most people living far below their potential. This chapter exposes the psychology of average thinking, reveals the hidden programming that shapes your decisions, and begins the shift into a new identity, one that thinks, acts, and evolves like the top 1%. Most people spend their entire lives thinking in ways they never chose. They inherit the mindset of the world around them, absorbing attitudes, fears, habits, assumptions, and beliefs without questioning where they came from or whether they are true. They grow up in environments where average thinking is the norm, and without realizing it, they begin to copy that mindset. They adopt the same worldview as the people around them. They repeat the same patterns, chase the same goals, avoid the same risks, and fear the same things. They don't think intentionally. They think automatically. They think the way they were taught, not the way they consciously choose. This is the beginning of the 99% mindset trap, a silent, psychological inheritance that shapes the lives of billions. The trap is subtle. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't pull you in violently. Instead, it feels normal. It feels comfortable. It feels like the safe way to live. The trap is built on cultural expectations, family beliefs, social pressure, past experiences, and emotional conditioning. It is built slowly, over years, until you mistake the trap for your identity. You begin to believe that the way you think is simply who you are, rather than realizing it is a product of your environment and your history. Most people never escape it because they don't even realize it exists. They live inside a box they never chose, believing the walls are the limits of reality. The 1% think differently because they refuse to accept inherited thinking. They do not let the world decide their beliefs. They do not let society define their reality. They do not let their past shape their future. They question everything, every assumption, every belief, every limit they were taught. They understand something most people never learn. Reality is not fixed. Identity is not fixed. Your potential is not fixed. Everything can be rewritten if you are willing to examine the mindset you've been living with. The 1% rise not because they are born special, but because they refuse to think like everyone else. The difference between the 1% and the 99% starts with how they interpret their own thoughts. The average person believes every thought is true. Every fear is justified. Every doubt is meaningful. Every insecurity is accurate. They trust their emotions as if emotions are reliable sources of truth. They trust their fears as if fear is wisdom. They trust their limitations as if limitations are permanent. They trust their excuses as if excuses are facts. But the top 1% do not trust every thought that enters their mind. They know their mind is a storyteller, not a truth teller. They know fears exaggerate. They know doubt lies. They know insecurity doesn't reflect reality. It reflects perception. Instead of believing every thought, they challenge their thoughts. They separate emotion from truth. They separate fear from fact. This is one of the first differences in thinking that separates the uncommon from the masses. Most people never examine the source of their mindset. They think the way they do because of the people who raised them, the culture they grew up in, and the experiences they have lived through. If they grew up around people who feared risk, they feared risk. If they grew up around people who saw success as difficult or rare, they adopt that belief. If they grew up around complaining, negativity, or scarcity, they internalize that worldview. They never question whether these beliefs are useful, accurate, or empowering. They simply accept them because they are familiar. But the familiar is not always the truth. The familiar is not always healthy. The familiar is not always the path to the life you want. The 99% mindset trap thrives because people believe their thoughts and habits are natural. They think, this is just who I am. But the truth is that identity is shaped deeply by the environment. If you were born into a different family, a different culture, a different socioeconomic group, and a different friend circle, you would think differently. You would have different fears, different values, different standards, and different beliefs. That alone proves that identity is not fixed, it's programmed. And if it can be programmed, it can be reprogrammed. This is what the 1% understand intuitively. Identity is not destiny. It is architecture. It can be redesigned intentionally. At the core of the 99% mindset trap is comfort. Not comfort as in relaxation or enjoyment, but comfort as a psychological addiction. Humans naturally choose what feels safe, predictable, and familiar. The problem is that comfort, when repeated too often, becomes a prison. It prevents growth. It prevents ambition. It prevents courage. It prevents progress. The average person seeks comfort because comfort feels good in the moment. But the 1% seek growth because growth feels good for a lifetime. The difference in long-term results comes from this difference in short-term decisions. The average person says, "I want to feel better now." The 1% say, "I want to become better permanently." That contrast creates two completely different lives. The average mindset also fears discomfort because discomfort exposes insecurity. It exposes weakness. It exposes lack of skill. It exposes the truth of whether you are truly committed or simply wishing. Most people avoid these exposures because they don't like who they become when they are uncomfortable. They don't like struggling. They don't like failing. They don't like being judged. They don't like not being the best. So they avoid discomfort entirely. They avoid situations where they might fail. They avoid challenges that might make them look foolish. They avoid goals that require real effort. They play life in safe mode, hoping to avoid pain. But in doing so, they also avoid transformation. The 1% operate differently. They do not run from discomfort. They search for it. They see discomfort as a teacher. They use it as a tool. They intentionally put themselves in situations that challenge them because they know pressure creates strength. They know difficulty forces growth. They know discomfort reveals new layers of capability. They do not fear discomfort because they see discomfort as a pathway to expansion. While the 99% avoid anything that threatens their self-image, the 1% seek opportunities that strengthen their self-image. This single contrast sets them on opposite trajectories. Another element of the 99% mindset trap is emotional decision-making. The average person lets their mood dictate their choices. If they feel tired, they quit early. If they feel insecure, they hide. If they feel unmotivated, they don't start. If they feel overwhelmed, they avoid. They live at the mercy of temporary emotions, which shifts their life in whatever direction the emotion pulls them. The 1% think differently. They do not trust temporary emotions to guide permanent decisions. They rely on intention, not impulse. They do what they committed to, not what they feel like. They act in alignment with their values, not their mood. They understand that emotions fluctuate, but identity must remain stable. They move with purpose, not anxiety. They choose direction, not reaction. This mindset makes them consistent, reliable, and unstoppable, regardless of how they feel. One of the strongest parts of the 99% trap is the fear of judgment. Average thinkers care deeply about the opinions of people who are not living the life they want. They fear criticism. They fear embarrassment. They fear standing out. They fear being talked about. They fear being misunderstood. They fear disappointing others. And because of this fear, they shrink. They lower their goals so they won't be judged if they fail. They hide their ambitions so no one laughs at them. They play small so they don't attract attention. They avoid trying new things so they won't look unskilled. They choose normal so they won't be questioned. This fear becomes a mental cage. It keeps people trapped at the level of those whose opinions they fear. But the 1% learned early that every great decision comes with judgment. People judge what they don't understand. They criticize what threatens their comfort. They laugh at what they haven't seen before. The 1% accept this as part of the process. They don't seek validation. They don't need permission. They don't wait for approval. They move forward regardless of opinions. They understand that if judgment stops you, success will never find you. They choose freedom over approval. Another characteristic of the average mindset is short-term thinking. The 99% prioritize immediate reward over long-term fulfillment. They chase quick pleasure, quick entertainment, quick distractions, quick comfort, and quick results. They want everything now, and they lack the patience required for meaningful progress. They underestimate the power of compounding. They underestimate the value of small daily actions. They underestimate how much can change in a year of consistency. They overestimate what they can do in a week and underestimate what they can do in 5 years. The 1% think long-term. They think in decades, not days. They think in outcomes, not impulses. They build with patience. They understand that mastery takes time. They understand that wealth takes consistency. They understand that strong identity develops through repetition. They play the long game, which means they win the game. The average mindset also operates from scarcity. Scarcity of opportunity. Scarcity of confidence. Scarcity of creativity. Scarcity of belief. This scarcity mindset whispers that there isn't enough to go around, that success is rare, that opportunity is limited, that wealth is for the lucky, that greatness is for the chosen. Scarcity thinking traps people in fear, jealousy, and limitation. Escaping the 99% mindset trap begins with confronting the truth that your current thinking is not truly yours. It is borrowed. It is inherited. It is shaped by people who may not have been living the life you want. Most of the beliefs you carry were created long before you ever had the ability to choose for yourself. You learned fear before you learned courage. You learned doubt before you learned confidence. You learned limitation before you learned potential. And without conscious effort, these early beliefs become the invisible chains holding your potential hostage. What the 1% eventually realize is that the mind you begin life with is not the mind you must live your life with. You can upgrade it, replace it, rebuild it, and refine it. But only if you first become aware of the outdated mental software running in the background. One of the strongest components of the 99% mindset is the belief that life happens to you rather than because of you. The average thinker sees themselves as a passenger in their own life, reacting to circumstances, waiting for opportunity, hoping for better conditions, wishing something external will change. They blame the economy, the government, their upbringing, their job, their boss, their partner, their lack of time, or their lack of luck. They look outward for reasons why they are stuck, believing their power sits in the hands of others. This mindset keeps them trapped because nothing changes until they change. The 1% adopt a completely different philosophy. They believe life is shaped from the inside out, not the outside in. They believe responsibility is power. They believe ownership is freedom. They believe that the moment you stop blaming, you start becoming. Personal responsibility is not a burden to them, it's a weapon. It allows them to shape their future independent of external circumstances. This doesn't mean they deny challenges. It means they refuse to surrender their lives to them. They treat responsibility as the gateway to control. And control is what allows transformation. Another layer of the 99% mindset trap is learned helplessness, the belief, often formed early in life, that effort doesn't matter. When someone grows up in an environment where success seems impossible or where effort goes unrewarded, they develop a false belief that their actions have little impact on their outcomes. This belief carries into adulthood, leading them to avoid risks, avoid trying new things, avoid pushing for more. They quietly accept the idea that success is for others, not them. They do not realize that the world changes drastically the moment they decide effort does matter if the results begin small. The 1% refuse to live with learned helplessness. They replace helplessness with adaptability. They replace passivity with initiative. They never wait for change, they create it. The 99% mindset is also fueled by distraction. Most people live in a constant cycle of noise notifications. Entertainment, meaningless scrolling, mental clutter, emotional stimulation, and digital addiction. Their attention is stolen every few minutes, preventing deep thought, preventing deep work, preventing meaningful self-awareness. When your mind is constantly filled with noise, you never get the clarity required to recognize your own patterns. You never gain the silence required to understand what you want. You never get the space required to think like the 1%. Distraction becomes a substitute for purpose. It keeps people busy without being productive. It keeps them entertained without being fulfilled. It keeps them occupied without evolving. The 1% guard their attention fiercely. They treat focus like currency. They treat clarity like gold. They understand that a distracted mind cannot create a powerful life. Another major component trapping the 99% is the obsession with certainty. They want every decision to feel safe before they act. They want guarantees. They want assurances. They want security. They want the path to be clear, predictable, and comfortable before they take the first step. But life never gives certainty in advance. Waiting for perfect clarity keeps people stuck for years. They postpone dreams. They delay change. They overthink instead of act. They analyze until the opportunity disappears. The 1% live by a different rule. Act first. Figure it out later. They understand that clarity is not a prerequisite, for action clarity is a result of action. They move while the 99% think about moving. They adapt while the 99% wait. They advance while the 99% freeze. The average mindset is also controlled by the need for external motivation. The 99% wait to feel like it before they begin. They depend on bursts of motivation to push them forward. When motivation is high, they take action. When motivation fades, as it always does, they stop. Their entire life is controlled by fluctuating emotions. But the 1% do not rely on motivation. They rely on standards. They rely on identity. They rely on discipline. They do not need to feel good to do what needs to be done. The 1% live by internal systems. The 99% live by emotional spikes. And that difference alone creates a lifetime of different outcomes. Another deeply rooted trap in the average mindset is the belief that everything must happen fast. The 99% want quick fixes, overnight results, easy solutions, shortcuts, and rapid transformation. They underestimate how long real change takes, and this leads to constant quitting. They start strong but cannot endure slow progress. And because most meaningful progress is invisible at first, they give up before the results appear. They never stay long enough to see the compounding effect that the 1% rely on. The 1% understand that slow success is still success. They understand that consistency compounds. They understand that small steps lead to massive outcomes. They do not fear slow progress, they fear stagnation. Another element of the 99%. Mindset trap is the tendency to outsource their beliefs to others. The average thinker lets society decide what is possible. They let friends influence their dreams. They let doubters shape their standards. They let small thinkers shrink their imagination. They let the opinions of non-achievers dictate how big they are allowed to think. They adopt limits that belong to someone else. The 1% do the opposite. They think independently. They analyze deeply. They question everything. They choose beliefs based on truth, not fear. They surround themselves with people who think bigger, not smaller. They understand that who you listen to shapes who you become. One of the most dangerous parts of the 99%. Mindset trap is its connection to past identity. Most people drag the weight of who they used to be into every new opportunity. They use old mistakes as evidence of future limitations. They interpret past failures as predictions. They let childhood programming control adulthood decisions. They see themselves through old stories, old labels, and old experiences. The problem is not that they failed, it's that they never updated their identity afterward. The 1% treat identity as a living thing, not a historical record. They reinvent themselves repeatedly. They shed old versions of themselves like layers. They do not cling to who they were. They commit to who they are becoming. The 99% mindset is also fueled by comparison. Average thinkers constantly look sideways at the progress of others. They compare themselves to people farther along and conclude they are behind. They compare their chapter 1 to someone else's chapter 50. They compare their potential to someone's peak. This creates insecurity, jealousy, and discouragement. Comparison makes them feel inadequate before they even begin. It kills momentum. It destroys confidence. It paralyzes action. The 1% understand that comparison is a trap because no two lives are alike. They compete with who they were yesterday, not with who someone else is today. They understand that progress is personal. They understand that the race is with themselves, not others. Another major trap shaping the 99% is the desire to avoid failure at all costs. The average thinker believes failure is a reflection of identity. They believe failure means they are not good enough, not worthy enough, not smart enough, or not capable enough. This belief creates paralysis. It stops them from trying, from experimenting, from risking, from learning. They play life so cautiously that they never discover what they could have become. The 1% have a fundamentally different relationship with failure. To them, failure is data. Failure is information. Failure is feedback. Failure is training. Failure is the price of mastery. They understand that the only people who never fail are the ones who never try. They embrace failure because they know every attempt sharpens their skill. Every setback builds resilience. Every mistake adds wisdom. Failure is not a sign of weakness. It is a sign of progress. The 99% mindset is also driven by the need to avoid discomforting truths. Average thinkers protect their ego by ignoring their weaknesses. They avoid honest self-assessment because the truth feels painful. They avoid accountability because accountability feels heavy. They avoid reflection because reflection feels confronting. They avoid looking in the mirror because they fear what they will see. But the 1% embrace honesty. They assess themselves ruthlessly. They identify flaws without emotion. They confront weaknesses without guilt. The moment you begin to challenge the beliefs that shaped your thinking, you start creating cracks in the walls of the 99% mindset trap. Most people never reach this point because challenging your beliefs feels like challenging your identity. It feels like shaking the foundation you've been standing on your entire life. And for many people, the fear of uncertainty feels worse than the pain of staying stuck. So they remain in the mindset they know, even if that mindset keeps them small. But the 1% understand an uncomfortable truth. You cannot build a powerful life on a weak foundation. You cannot build an exceptional future on average thinking. You cannot design a great life with default settings. Breaking old beliefs is the first step toward upgrading the mind. One of the biggest beliefs keeping people trapped is the idea that success requires something external, something they do not have. They believe success requires better circumstances, better timing, better background, better confidence, or better luck. They underestimate their ability and overestimate the requirements. This belief stops them before they even start. It convinces them that the gap between them and the life they want is too big to cross. But the 1% know the secret. Success rarely requires more than what you already have. It requires better thinking, not better conditions. It requires courage, not luck. It requires responsibility, not excuses. It requires identity shift, not external change. Once the mind changes, the world around you begins to shift with it. Another psychological pattern within the 99%. Mindset trap is the habit of seeing obstacles as permanent barriers instead of temporary challenges. The average thinker encounters difficulty and takes it as a sign that the goal is too big or the dream unrealistic. They believe struggle means stop, rather than understanding that struggle is part of the process. They see problems as roadblocks, rather than puzzles. They view setbacks as evidence that they are not meant for more. This mindset destroys potential. The 1% have the opposite reaction to obstacles. They treat challenges as signals. When something becomes difficult, they lean in. They understand that obstacles are not dead ends, they are filters. They filter out those who are uncommitted from those who are serious. Most people quit at the filter. The 1% pass through it. Another layer of the average mindset is the belief that someone else knows better. The 99% defer to authority, waiting for someone to tell them what to do, how to think, when to move, and what choices are right. They live in a state of psychological dependency. They want instructions. They want permission. They want certainty delivered by someone else. This dependence strips them of agency, but the 1% do not hand their thinking to anyone. They seek knowledge, yes, but they form their own conclusions. They make decisions. They take ownership of their direction. They trust their judgment. They understand something the 99% never learn. No one is coming to save you, guide you, push you, or choose for you. Your life is yours alone. Another trap that holds the average person hostage is the illusion of later. Later becomes a comfortable lie people tell themselves when they want to avoid action today. They say they will start later, when things calm down, when they feel ready, when they have more time, when they're less stressed, when they understand more, when someone supports them, when they feel confident. Later becomes the graveyard of potential. Entire lives are wasted waiting for the right time. The 1% reject the concept of later entirely. They know that there is no perfect moment. They know that waiting will not create clarity. They know that readiness comes from action, not from time. They understand that every day wasted makes the climb harder. Their mindset is simple. Start now, refine later. Move now, learn on the way. Act now. Adapt as needed. Another deeply rooted part of the 99% mindset trap is the emotional attachment to old stories. These stories are narratives people repeat about themselves. It's often without realizing they are not factual. They are emotional. Stories like, I'm not consistent. I always fail. I'm not good at learning new things. I can't change. I don't deserve more, or I never get opportunities. These stories are powerful, not because they are true, but because they go unchallenged. The longer a story stays unchallenged, the more real it feels. The 1% do not allow negative stories to linger unexamined. They question them immediately. They ask themselves, is this actually true? Or is this a comfort story keeping me from growing? When you challenge your stories, you begin to separate your identity from your history. And once you separate the two, your potential expands instantly. A major component of the average mindset trap is the emotional dependence on validation. People in the 99% mindset seek approval because approval makes them feel safe. It makes them feel accepted. It gives them the illusion that their choices are correct. But this dependence is dangerous because it ties your self-worth to the reactions of others. When validation becomes your compass, you lose your own. The 1% detach from the need for approval. They don't seek permission to dream bigger than others. They don't seek support to pursue their vision. They don't need applause to stay committed. Their validation comes from alignment, from identity, from purpose, not from opinions. The person who needs approval will always live a deluded life. The 99% mindset trap also teaches people to play not to lose instead of playing to win. Average thinkers move carefully, cautiously, trying not to make mistakes, trying not to fail, trying not to look foolish. Their focus is on avoiding pain rather than pursuing potential. But avoiding pain is not the path to a meaningful life. It is the path to a comfortable but unfulfilled one. The 1% see life as opportunity-rich, not danger-rich. They play to win. They move toward what they want instead of away from what they fear. They take calculated risks. They expand their comfort zone intentionally. They understand that everything they want sits on the other side of risk, and that avoiding risk is the fastest way to lose by default. Another part of the average mindset is the desperation for shortcuts. People in the 99% want the hack, the trick, the magic formula, the instant result. They jump from idea to idea searching for the easiest path. But what they fail to realize is that shortcuts often lead to detours. They lead to partial results, empty progress, and fragile foundations. The 1% are not interested in shortcuts. They are interested in mastery. They understand that mastery takes time, repetition, and endurance. They commit to the long route because they know it produces breakthroughs that shortcuts never will. The 99% mindset trap convinces people that small improvements don't matter. They underestimate the value of one better decision. One disciplined day, 1 hour of focus, 1 page of reading, 1 repetition of effort. Because they don't see immediate change, they dismiss small habits as insignificant. This mindset prevents compounding. But the 1% understand that small actions are not small, they are seeds. They understand that every significant transformation begins with tiny changes repeated consistently. They know that small habits shape identity. Identity shapes destiny. Another trap keeping people in the 99% is the belief that success requires extraordinary talent. They imagine that the 1% are gifted in ways normal people aren't. They think success is unlocked through natural intelligence, perfect conditions, or some hidden advantage. But this belief is comforting, not true. It lets people avoid responsibility. It lets them say, I can't do what they did, instead of asking, what would happen if I tried? The 1% do not rely on talent. They rely on strategy, consistency, discipline, and identity. The average person uses lack of talent as an excuse. The 1% turn it into motivation. Another psychological dimension of the 99%. Mindset trap is emotional fragility. Average thinkers break easily under stress, discomfort, rejection, or criticism. They don't want to be uncomfortable. They don't want to feel unsure. They don't want to experience emotional turbulence. So they avoid situations that demand emotional resilience. They don't realize that resilience is built through exposure, not avoidance. The 1% develop emotional toughness because they regularly face challenge, discomfort, uncertainty, and pressure. They don't avoid emotional adversity, they train for it. This mindset gives them inner strength that becomes unshakable over time. Another part of the average mindset trap is the belief that circumstances determine destiny. The 99% believe they need a better past to create a better future. They believe their upbringing, their failures, their mistakes, or their disadvantages have doomed them. This story keeps them stuck because they believe their environment is more powerful than their identity. But the 1% refuse to let circumstances define them. They redefine themselves through decisions. They refuse to be shaped by where they started. They build new identities, and those identities create new futures. They prove repeatedly that the strongest force is not circumstance, it is choice. The 99% mindset trap also operates through emotional misinterpretation. Average thinkers interpret discomfort as danger, boredom as lack of meaning, fear as a stop signal, and confusion as a reason to quit. The 1% interpret these emotions differently. Discomfort means growth. Boredom means mastery. Fear means opportunity. Confusion means learning. The same emotion interpreted differently produces a completely different life. This is why the 1% live with internal clarity the average person never experiences. Once you recognize the 99% mindset trap for what it truly is, you begin to sense a new possibility. A possibility that the life you want is not blocked by external forces, but by internal patterns you've been carrying unconsciously. This realization is both empowering and uncomfortable. Empowering because it means you have the ability to change your life through mental evolution. Uncomfortable because it removes the excuses that have protected you for years. The moment you understand that your past thinking has been limiting your future, you can no longer hide behind blame. You can no longer justify stagnation. You can no longer pretend you don't know what's holding you back. Awareness forces responsibility, and responsibility forces growth. However, awakening from the average mindset is not an immediate transformation. It is a gradual shedding of mental habits that have shaped you for years. It feels like peeling back layers of identity, one hard truth at a time. At first, the mind resists. It clings to old beliefs because they feel safe, they feel familiar. They feel like home, even if that home is suffocating. The ego fights change because change threatens the version of you it has been protecting. And yet the mind knows that staying the same will cost more than evolving. This inner conflict is the first stage of breaking out of the trap. The 1% do not avoid this stage, they push through it. With intention, one of the first mental patterns people must shed is the belief that they are ordinary. Not in the sense that they are superior to others, but in the sense that they limit their own potential by assuming they have little to offer. The average thinker dismisses their strengths, downplays their abilities, and exaggerates their weaknesses. They assume others are more capable. They assume greatness belongs to a select few. They assume success is for the lucky or the talented. But these assumptions are learned, not innate. They are internalized from environments where ambition was mocked, or success was rare, or big dreams were treated as unrealistic. The 1% never let these beliefs take root. They understand that potential is not predetermined. Talent is only a starting point. Skill is developed. Power is earned. Confidence is built. Every extraordinary person began as an ordinary one until they changed how they thought. Another pattern that keeps people trapped is the habit of living in reaction instead of creation. The 99% respond to life they rarely initiate. They wake up and react to messages, notifications, problems, tasks, expectations, and obligations. Their entire day is shaped by what comes to them rather than what they choose to pursue. When you live your life on reaction, you never get ahead. You only manage what already exists. The 1% live proactively. They create agendas. They set direction. They choose priorities. They begin their day with intention. They do not wait for life to push them. They push life. This shift from reactive thinking to proactive thinking is one of the most significant mindset changes that separates the successful from the stagnant. The 99% mindset trap also manifests in how people talk to themselves. Most people have an internal voice that criticizes doubts, judges, and minimizes. It tells them they're not ready, not worthy, not capable, not smart enough, not disciplined enough. This voice becomes so familiar that they stop recognizing it as optional. They accept it as truth. But the 1% treat their inner dialogue as a tool. They reshape it. They curate it. They direct it. They build internal language that reinforces strength. Their inner voice becomes a coach, not a critic, a motivator, not a suppressor. This does not mean they lie to themselves with empty positivity. It means they choose thoughts that build them instead of break them. Architecture for identity rather than as a weapon against themselves. Another powerful dimension of the 99% trap is emotional impulsivity. The average person allows emotions to dictate decisions, behavior, and direction. If they feel overwhelmed, they avoid. If they feel insecure, they shrink. If they feel tired, they stop. If they feel frustrated, they quit. If they feel unsure, they freeze. Living this way makes emotional, whether the ruler of your life. The 1% experience the same emotions, but they do not obey them. They feel the fear and act anyway. They feel the doubt and move forward regardless. They feel the discomfort and do not allow it to change the plan. Emotional discipline is the difference between someone who makes progress occasionally and someone who makes progress relentlessly. The 1% learn to separate how they feel from what they do, and that separation is power. Another part of the 99% mindset trap is an addiction to certainty. Most people fear the unknown so deeply that they limit their lives to what feels predictable. They avoid risks. They avoid new opportunities. They avoid new skills. They avoid bold moves. They avoid anything that introduces uncertainty, because uncertainty triggers fear. But the 1% understand that uncertainty is where all growth happens. They know that certainty is the enemy of expansion. They accept that you cannot control everything, and that the unknown is where new possibilities exist. They embrace uncertainty with curiosity instead of fear. They do not demand guaranteed outcomes. They trust their ability to adapt. This trust creates confidence far deeper than the kind the 99% chase. 1. Major psychological pattern of the average. Mindset is the belief that problems are signs of failure rather than part of life. The 99% approach problems emotionally. They get frustrated, discouraged, overwhelmed, or defeated. They allow problems to break their momentum. They internalize setbacks as personal flaws, rather than viewing them as neutral challenges. But the 1% approach problems strategically. They detach emotionally. They analyze calmly. They look for solutions. They adapt quickly. To them, problems are not proof of inadequacy. They are proof that growth is happening. A life without problems is a life without progress. This shift in perspective is one of the core mental differences between those who rise and those who remain stuck. Another dimension of the average mindset is the craving for comfort, even when comfort leads to long-term dissatisfaction. Many people will choose familiar discomfort over the temporary discomfort of change. They stay in unfulfilling jobs, empty relationships, unhealthy habits, and predictable routines because change feels scary. But the discomfort of stagnation slowly destroys confidence, energy, clarity, and hope. The 1% choose meaningful discomfort with purpose. They tolerate pressure, challenge, effort, and uncertainty because those discomforts lead to growth, fulfillment, and expansion. They understand that the price of the life they want is temporary discomfort, and the price of the life they don't want is permanent regret. Another trap that keeps people stuck is the tendency to self-identify with past experiences. The 99% say, "This is who I've always been," without realizing that identity is fluid. They believe their past mistakes define their future potential. They believe their past failures predict their future outcomes. They believe the hardest chapters of their life contain all the information necessary to determine who they are. But the 1% understand that identity is a construction, not a memory. They reinvent themselves repeatedly. They allow themselves to evolve. They give themselves permission to become someone they've never been. They know that the past is a place of reference, not a place of residence. The future belongs to those who refuse to be defined by what came before. Another part of the 99% mindset trap is the inability to separate effort from outcome. Average thinkers associate effort with immediate results. When results do not appear quickly, they feel the effort is wasted. They assume they are doing something wrong. They interpret slow progress as lack of ability. This causes them to quit prematurely. The 1% mentally detach effort from immediate reward. They understand the lag between input and output. They trust the process, even when there is no visible progress. They do the work because the work is the path. Do not ask, "Is this working today?" They ask, "Will this be working 6 months from now if I stay consistent?" This ability to remain committed despite temporary invisibility is a superpower the 99% rarely develop. Another aspect of the average mindset is fear of being a beginner. Many people avoid starting new things because they fear looking inexperienced, unskilled, or foolish. They compare their early attempts to someone else's mastery. They expect themselves to be good immediately. And when they aren't, they interpret it as a sign they shouldn't try. But the 1% embrace beginnerhood. They understand that every master was once a beginner. They understand that skill is developed through repetition. They understand that improvement requires awkwardness, mistakes, and learning curves. They are willing to look inexperienced because they know it's only temporary. Their ego does not prevent them from growing. Another layer of the 99% mindset trap is the misunderstanding of fear. Average thinkers treat fear as a stop sign. They believe fear means danger. They believe fear means don't do this. But fear often signals opportunity, not danger. It indicates areas of growth. It indicates paths with potential. It indicates challenges that could expand you. The 1% feel fear just as intensely as anyone else, but they interpret it differently. They ask themselves, "Is this fear protecting me or limiting me?" In most cases, fear is limiting. Once they see that, they move forward anyway. Courage is not the absence of fear, it is the refusal to obey fear. The deeper you look into the 99% mindset trap, the more you begin to see that it doesn't operate like a single obvious barrier. It operates like a network of small beliefs, emotional reactions, psychological habits, and learned behaviors that quietly accumulate over the years. Each one on its own seems harmless, just a thought, just a fear, just a habit, just a preference. But together, they form a mental cage. A cage that is invisible, not because it is subtle, but because it has been normalized by society. When a mindset is shared by millions, it becomes almost invisible. And invisible traps are the hardest to escape. one of the most subtle aspects of the average. Mindset is the tendency to interpret life through a narrow lens. The 99% often see the world in fixed terms, fixed personality, fixed intelligence, fixed opportunity, fixed fate. They believe that who they are today is a fairly accurate representation of who they will be tomorrow. This creates a mental ceiling. It convinces them that new skills are out of reach, new paths are unrealistic, and reinvention is impossible. But this belief is built on misunderstanding. Human beings are not fixed creatures. They are adaptive. They are malleable. The brain rewires. Identity rewires. Behavior rewires. But this rewiring only happens when someone stops treating their present self as their permanent self. The 1% know that who they are is temporary and who they can become is limitless. They do not allow their past to dictate their potential. Another characteristic of the 99% mindset is the tendency to outsource emotional responsibility. Many people believe their emotions are controlled by circumstances they cannot influence. They say things like, "They made me angry," "This situation stressed me out," "It's ruined my day," or "I can't be happy until things change." These statements seem harmless, but they reveal a deeper mindset. The belief that your internal world is a product of external events. When this belief is active, you become emotionally powerless. Your mood, focus, and identity become enslaved to whatever happens outside of you. But the 1% understand that emotional responsibility is internal. They do not deny emotions, they learn to regulate them. They do not suppress emotions, they interpret them differently. They understand that while they cannot always control circumstances, they can always control meaning, and meaning determines emotion. The average mindset also struggles with delayed gratification. Many people are trapped because they constantly choose what feels good now over what will feel better later. They pick comfort over growth, entertainment over discipline, distraction over progress, and ease over challenge. They want immediate relief from discomfort, so they sabotage long-term fulfillment for short-term pleasure. But the 1% master the art of waiting. They willingly delay gratification because they see beyond the moment. They choose the discomfort that leads to growth rather than the comfort that leads to regret. They understand that every major transformation requires sacrifice, and sacrifice is the currency of the 1%. Another layer of the average mindset trap is the belief that effort is something to be avoided rather than something to be embraced. The 99% see effort as a sign that something is too hard, too demanding, or too complicated. They believe effort is a negative signal, a reason to quit or reconsider. But the 1% see effort as a positive sign, a sign that they are pushing into new territory, strengthening new skills, and building resilience. Effort is not a punishment to them. It is proof that they are stepping into a bigger life. They understand that the presence of effort means they are on the edge of growth. The 99% mindset is also shaped by a deep aversion to uncertainty. Uncertainty triggers anxiety, doubt, and hesitation. It makes people feel exposed. It makes them feel vulnerable. So they cling to familiar patterns, even if those patterns keep them stagnant. They prefer predictable misery over unpredictable opportunity. But the 1% view uncertainty through a different lens. They see uncertainty as possibility. They see it as a blank space where new futures can be created. They understand that certainty locks you into the past, while uncertainty opens the door to the future. Uncertainty is not something they avoid, it is something they navigate. Another psychological trap that keeps the 99% stuck is the assumption that their future is a continuation of their past. They use their previous failures as evidence that they will fail again. They use their childhood as evidence of their limitations. They use old habits as proof that change is impossible. But the 1% understand that the past is only information, not identity. They mine their past for lessons, but they do not allow it to define their direction. They know transformation happens when you stop repeating your history and start designing your future. Another dimension of the average mindset trap is the belief that someone else must create the opportunity. The 99% wait for the right moment the right person, the right situation, the right sign, or the right conditions. They wait for external permission to pursue their goals. They wait for the green light that never comes. But the 1% create opportunity through action. They build momentum through movement. They do not wait for conditions to be perfect. They start. They understand that opportunity does not appear until effort appears. The 99% wait for the path to clear. The 1% begin walking and create the path as they go. One of the most dangerous aspects of the 99% mindset is the belief that struggle means something is wrong. When average thinkers face difficulty, they assume they made a bad decision. They interpret struggle as evidence that they are not capable. They believe the process should feel smooth. But the 1% understand that struggle is not a sign of being off track. It is a sign of being on the right track. It means they are challenging themselves, stretching their limits, and entering new territory. The presence of difficulty is a sign that growth is happening. The absence of difficulty is a sign that stagnation is happening. The 99% mindset trap also includes a strong reliance on external validation. Many people look to others to determine if their decisions are appropriate or acceptable. They want reassurance. They want encouragement. They want confirmation that their choices make sense. But the 1% realize that external validation is unreliable. It fluctuates. It often comes from people who do not have the life they want. The 1% learn to validate themselves. They stand behind their decisions. They trust their vision. They do not need applause to move forward. Their validation comes from alignment, not approval. Another component of the average mindset trap is the belief that confidence must come before action. The 99% wait to feel confident before starting something new. They wait to feel ready before pursuing bigger goals. They wait for the inner feeling of certainty before they take a step. But the 1% know that confidence is created by action, not the other way around. You gain confidence by doing, not by thinking. You build confidence by facing discomfort, not avoiding it. You grow confidence by proving to yourself that you can survive challenges. The 1% act first and allow confidence to follow. The average mindset also struggles with self-image rigidity. Many people cling to outdated versions of themselves because changing self-image requires confronting weaknesses. If someone sees themselves as lazy, they continue acting lazy. If they see themselves as undisciplined, they avoid discipline. If they see themselves as not smart, they avoid learning. If they see themselves as unlucky, they avoid opportunity. The 1% refuse to freeze their self-image. They treat identity as fluid. They revise it. They upgrade it. They evolve it. They understand that the version of you that created your current life cannot create your next life. Another psychological aspect of the 99% mindset trap is the tendency to catastrophize. Average thinkers often imagine the worst possible outcome and treat it as the most likely one. They exaggerate risks. They magnify fears. They distort possibilities. This makes them overly cautious and discourages bold action. The 1% understand that fear-based imagination is inaccurate. They challenge their worst-case scenarios. They question whether their fears are logical. They recognize that most imagined dangers never happen. This ability to reduce emotional exaggeration allows them to take risks that others avoid. The 99% mindset trap is also fueled by impatience. Most people quit because progress feels too slow. They expect immediate results and become discouraged when results take time. They underestimate how long mastery takes. They underestimate how long identity change takes. They underestimate how long consistency must last before transformation appears. But the 1% respect the timeline. They know real progress often happens silently for months before it becomes visible. They trust the process because they understand the lag between effort and outcome. Another component of the average mindset trap is the unwillingness to audit their life. Many people continue living with habits, relationships, environments, and routines that no longer serve them simply because they never review them. They never ask themselves whether their habits are aligned with their goals. They never question whether their environment supports their potential. They never evaluate whether their relationships elevate or drain them. The The 1% audit ruthlessly. They examine everything with honesty. They remove what no longer aligns. They refine constantly. Their life is intentional, not accidental. When you begin stepping out of the 99% mindset trap, even slightly, the world starts to look different, not because the world changed, but because your lens did. The patterns that once controlled you suddenly become visible. You begin noticing the assumptions that shaped your behavior. You notice the beliefs that limited your actions. You notice the fears that dictated your decisions. You notice the excuses that disguise themselves as logic. For the first time, you begin to see that the life you lived was not built by your potential, but by your patterns. And this realization is both sobering and liberating. Sobering, because you recognize how much time was lost under the influence of old thinking. Liberating, because you now see that everything ahead is still yours to shape. One of the first changes you notice as you exit the average. Mindset is how different your interpretation of discomfort becomes. The 99% see discomfort as a threat, a sign that something is wrong, a force to escape. They have been conditioned to believe that anything difficult, uncertain, or challenging is dangerous. But once you begin thinking differently, discomfort transforms from an enemy into a compass. You start to realize that discomfort is not a sign to retreat, it is a sign to advance. Growth lives behind discomfort. Strength lives behind discomfort. Identity upgrade lives behind discomfort. Once you feel that shift internally, you start seeking discomfort strategically instead of avoiding it instinctively. This is one of the first real signs that you are breaking the trap. Another shift that happens when you elevate. Your mindset is the change in how you perceive failure. Previously, failure felt like an identity, wound, a confirmation of inadequacy or proof you weren't capable. But when you begin to think like the 1%, failure becomes neutral information. It becomes feedback, not finality. It becomes data, not a definition. You begin to see that failure doesn't say anything about who you are. It says something about what you tried. And what you try can always be improved. This mindset frees you from the fear of trying. The average mind minimizes action because it fears judgment. The elevated mind embraces action because it values learning. This shift alone creates a level of freedom that the 99% never experience. Another fundamental shift that occurs when you break out of the average mindset is the way you relate to time. Most people live in short-term cycles, thinking only about today, this week, and maybe next month. They underestimate the power of long-term consistency. They underestimate what can be built over years. But when you begin to think like the 1%, you stop measuring success in days and start measuring it in decades. You realize that the timeline of your life is longer and more flexible than you were ever taught. You have the ability to reshape your future, not through extreme action, but through sustained, meaningful action. The 1% do not rush. They build. They do not sprint. They set a pace that compounds. They don't obsess over instant gratification. They obsess over inevitable results created through long-term discipline. This mental shift is profound. It changes how you work, how you plan, and how you endure as your mindset evolves. Your tolerance for mediocrity begins to vanish, not just externally, but internally. You start noticing when you're lying to yourself. You notice when you're lowering your standards. You notice when you're cutting corners. You notice when you're making excuses disguised as explanations. This awareness is not comfortable. It forces you to confront parts of yourself you once avoided. But this is where transformation begins. The 99% avoid self-confrontation because it threatens their identity. The 1% seek it because it strengthens theirs. When you are no longer willing to tolerate your own excuses, the trap begins to lose its hold. Another powerful shift that occurs as you break free is the way you evaluate relationships. When you lived with a 99% mindset, you may have tolerated friendships or relationships that drained you, distracted you, or pulled you backward, not necessarily out of malice, but out of habit. You may have surrounded yourself with people who were comfortable staying the same, people who normalized mediocrity, people who feared growth, or people who discouraged ambition because it made them uncomfortable. But when your mindset elevates, you begin to feel out of place in those environments. You begin to crave conversations that challenge you. You want to be around people who think bigger, who take responsibility, who reject excuses, who discuss ideas, not gossip. You become sensitive to the energy around you. You start recognizing which people lift you and which people limit you. And as difficult as it can be, you begin making the decisions necessary to align your environment with your evolution. This shift is one of the most important steps in permanently escaping the trap. Another change that emerges when thinking like the 1% is the reversal of your relationship with risk. The 99% see risk as something to be avoided, something dangerous, something that threatens security. But once your mindset changes, you begin to see that risk and opportunity are two sides of the same coin. You realize that the greatest risk is often doing nothing. The greatest danger is staying the same. The greatest threat is never growing. The irony is that avoiding risk becomes the biggest risk. The 1% treat risk as a strategy, not a threat. They manage it. They prepare for it. They adapt to it. They leverage it. And because they are willing to engage with risk, they access opportunities the 99% never see. Another powerful shift is the transformation of your thought process around responsibility. The average mindset sees responsibility as a burden, something heavy, something to avoid. But the elevated mindset sees responsibility as control. When you take responsibility for your actions, thoughts, decisions, and outcomes, you place power back into your own hands. This is why the 1% run toward responsibility. They seek it. They embrace it. They understand that responsibility is not weight. It is leverage. It gives them influence over their life. It gives them sovereignty. It gives them the ability to create change instead of waiting for it. When you begin to think this way, you realize that responsibility is the true currency of freedom. And freedom is the foundation of the 1% mindset. As you continue breaking free, you also begin to develop a different relationship with identity itself. The 99% treat identity as something fixed, something they must defend, something they must stay consistent with. They resist change because it feels like betrayal. But the 1% treat identity as a tool. They update it as needed. They redefine themselves repeatedly. They allow themselves to grow into new roles, new possibilities, new levels of self-control. Their identity is flexible, evolving, and expansive. This fluidity gives them the power to reinvent themselves whenever necessary. Average thinkers cling to who they were. Exceptional thinkers focus on who they are becoming. Another shift you experience as you elevate. Your mindset is the emergence of self-trust. Most people do not trust themselves. They do not trust themselves to follow through, to stay consistent, to resist temptation, to handle uncertainty, or to recover from failure. So they hesitate. They stay small. They avoid challenge. But when your mindset grows, you begin proving to yourself that you can rely on your own discipline. You start following through on commitments, not because someone is watching, but because you respect yourself. You keep promises to yourself. You act even when you don't feel like it. Over time, this builds a deep internal trust. You begin to believe you are capable. You begin to believe you are resilient. You begin to believe you can handle whatever comes next. When self-trust deepens, the trap collapses completely. Another mental shift that occurs is the way you react to other people's success. The 99% often react with jealousy, resentment, insecurity, or comparison. Someone else's achievement becomes a reminder of their own unfulfilled potential. They interpret success as competition or as proof that they are falling behind. But the 1% react entirely differently. They see success as evidence that success is possible. They see it as inspiration. They see it as motivation. They see it as confirmation that greatness is not reserved for a select few. When your mindset elevates, someone else winning no longer threatens you. It encourages you. It expands your belief in what is available. This shift alone liberates enormous mental energy. Another change you notice is the shift in your relationship with decisions. The average mindset overthinks, hesitates, second-guesses, and delays. They fear choosing incorrectly. They fear making the wrong move. They fear regret. But thinking like the 1% brings decisiveness. Not impulsive action, but confident action. Elevated thinkers understand that progress is made through decisions, and indecision is the biggest enemy of momentum. They accept that some decisions will be wrong, but wrong decisions can be corrected. A lifetime of indecision cannot. The 1% move with clarity because they know movement creates clarity. As you break out of the trap, your standards rise naturally. You stop tolerating things you once tolerated, not because you think you're better than others, but because you're better than your old self. You no longer tolerate wasted time, negative conversations, unproductive habits, emotional chaos, or low-level thinking. Your standards rise not as a performance, but as a reflection of your identity, and your life begins to shift around your standards. People respond differently. Opportunities respond differently. Your environment responds differently. Your mind responds differently. As you continue to break away from the 99% mindset trap, something remarkable happens. You begin noticing how deeply the world encourages average thinking. You see how society normalizes mediocrity. You see how people are praised for fitting in, not standing out. You see how comfort is marketed as happiness, and how ambition is labeled as excessive, unrealistic, or even selfish. You see how fear is used to maintain predictability, and how conformity is disguised as stability. And the more your awareness grows, the more clearly you recognize that the 99% mindset is not just a personal limitation, it is a cultural one. It is the operating system of the masses. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. One of the most eye-opening realizations is how many people live their lives on autopilot, following invisible scripts they never chose. The script says, get a safe job. Avoid risks. Don't fail. Don't stand out too much. Don't challenge the norm. Don't dream too big. Don't make others uncomfortable. Don't question authority. Don't break routine. Live predictable. Live safe. Live acceptable. Live approved. You see this script everywhere in schools, in workplaces, in families, in conversations. Most people follow it without question because they never realized they could write a new script. But the moment you recognize the script is optional, you begin to rewrite your life with intention. And rewriting your script is the essence of the 1% mindset. Another striking change that happens as you elevate mentally is how you begin to value solitude. The 99% fill every moment with noise music, social media, conversations, notifications, distractions, anything to avoid being alone with their thoughts. Silence feels uncomfortable because in silence, self-awareness emerges. But when you begin thinking differently, silence becomes clarity. Solitude becomes fuel. You find peace in reflection. You find strength in introspection. You stop fearing your thoughts and start directing them. The 1% understand that solitude is where identity evolves, where strategy forms, where vision strengthens, where the noise of the world cannot influence your direction. Solitude becomes a necessity, not an avoidance. Another powerful transformation is the shift in how you interpret time. The 99% talk about wasting time only when they lose hours. But the 1% understand that the real danger lies in wasted years, wasted potential, wasted purpose, wasted identity. They see time through a macro lens. They don't ask, what do I feel like doing today? They ask, who do I want to become in 10 years? And what must I do today to align with that? Their relationship with time creates a sense of urgency, not from fear, but from gratitude. They understand that each day is a deposit toward the life they are building. They know that time compounds even more powerfully than money. As you shift into this mindset, you begin valuing time with a seriousness the average mindset cannot understand. You stop letting trivial distractions steal hours. You stop allowing low-value conversations to drain energy. You stop agreeing to obligations that do not serve your future. Your time becomes sacred. Another change that occurs when you break from the average mindset is that you begin to develop a deeper sense of internal accountability. The 99% rely heavily on external systems to keep them in check. Bosses, deadlines, reminders, pressures, rules, consequences. They need something outside of themselves to maintain structure. But when you elevate mentally, accountability becomes internal. You hold yourself to your own standards. You expect yourself to follow through. You don't need someone watching you to stay disciplined. You don't need pressure to perform. You don't need fear to motivate you. This internal accountability is one of the strongest signs of a 1% mindset. It means you have reclaimed ownership of your behavior instead of outsourcing control to the world around you. Another profound internal shift is the way you begin viewing pain. The 99% see pain as something unfair, something to avoid, something to numb or escape. But the 1% recognize pain as a teacher. They understand that emotional pain exposes truth. Mental pain reveals limits. Physical pain reveals endurance. They understand that pain is a messenger, not an enemy. When something hurts, it means something important is being highlighted: weakness, avoidance, insecurity, imbalanced priorities, unresolved wounds. Instead of running from pain, they listen to it. They use it. They extract wisdom from it. And because they face pain instead of avoiding it, they develop emotional resilience far beyond that of the average person. Another shift that signifies escape from the 99% mindset trap is the change in what you consider normal. Once you start thinking like the 1%, average patterns begin to look foreign. Gossip becomes noise. Complaining becomes pointless. Blame becomes weakness. Excuses become transparent. Procrastination becomes self-sabotage. Distraction becomes dangerous. Low effort becomes unacceptable. You start to feel dissonance when you witness average thinking because you no longer operate from the same psychological place. It's like speaking a new language in a room full of people who only understand the old one. You feel the separation not arrogantly, but clearly. You become aware that average behavior no longer aligns with your identity. Another transformation that happens as you elevate your thinking is that your tolerance for victim mentality disappears. The 99% often default to seeing themselves as victims of circumstance, blaming their environment, their upbringing, their relationships, their luck, or the world for their situation. This mindset keeps them stuck because it convinces them that they are powerless. But once you step into the 1% mindset, victimhood feels suffocating. It feels dishonest. It feels weak. You begin rejecting any narrative that strips you of agency. Even when circumstances are unfair, you focus on what you can control, not what you cannot. You stop complaining. You stop blaming. You stop waiting. You stop expecting rescue. You embrace responsibility fully, not because it is easy, but because responsibility is the only path that leads to freedom. Another profound shift is the change in how you evaluate success. The 99% associate success with outcomes, results, money, recognition, achievements, but the 1% associates success with alignment with identity, alignment with purpose, alignment with standards, alignment with long-term vision. They define success by consistency, not applause, by discipline, not validation, by growth, not comparison. This mindset keeps them grounded. It prevents them from being derailed by temporary failure or inflated by temporary wins. It allows them to stay focused on who they are becoming rather than what they are collecting along the way. As you continue elevating your mindset, you also begin developing a sharpened sense of clarity about what you want and why you want it. The 99% often chase goals they don't fully understand, goals that come from social pressure, comparison, insecurity, or external expectations. They pursue things because others value them, not because they genuinely desire them. But the 1% think deeply about desire. They reflect. They question. They examine. They choose goals that align with their identity, values, and purpose. This clarity brings strength. It creates direction. It prevents unnecessary detours. And with clarity, discipline becomes easier because you're not chasing goals out of impulse. You're pursuing goals out of conviction. Another shift occurs in the way you relate to fear. The average mindset sees fear as a barrier, something that blocks the path forward. But as you elevate your thinking, you begin to see fear as a guide. Fear reveals where the next level of your growth is hiding. If something scares you, it usually means it matters. It usually means it's meaningful. It usually means it has potential to transform you. The 1% use fear as a compass. They move toward what intimidates them, not away from it. This transforms fear into fuel. Another powerful transformation happens when you begin separating your identity from your habits. The 99% believe their habits reflect who they are. If they procrastinate, they call themselves lazy. If they struggle with discipline, they label themselves undisciplined. If they make mistakes, they label themselves failures. These labels become self-fulfilling. But the 1% understand that habits reflect training, not identity. Habits can be changed. Habits can be replaced. Habits can be rebuilt. They understand that behavior comes from systems, not destiny. So instead of blaming themselves, they redesign their environment. They adjust their routines. They modify their triggers. They restructure their systems. They take responsibility for creating conditions that support the identity they want to embody. Another shift that takes place is the emergence of internal peace, not the peace that comes from avoiding difficulty, but the peace that comes from facing difficulty with confidence. The 99% believe peace is found through comfort. But comfort-driven peace is fragile. It breaks under pressure. It disappears when challenges arise. The 1% cultivate a peace grounded in capability. They know they can endure. They know they can adapt. They know they can overcome. This creates a deep internal calm, even in chaotic situations. You begin to develop this same calm as you exit the average mindset. You stop panicking under stress. You stop overthinking uncertainty. You stop fearing challenges. You begin responding rather than reacting. As you move even further from the 99% mindset trap, a profound internal transformation begins unfolding, a shift that most people never experience in their lifetime. It's not a sudden change. It's a steady awakening, a gradual rise in consciousness that begins to influence the way you think, the way you interpret the world, and the way you see yourself. This shift is quiet but powerful. It's like a slow sunrise that eventually reveals a landscape that was always there but never fully visible. You begin to realize that life was never about becoming someone else. It was about removing the layers of fear, conditioning, and limitation that prevented you from seeing who you were capable of being all along. One of the most significant realizations at this stage is that the 99% mindset trap thrives on unconsciousness. It thrives when you are unaware of yourself, unaware of your habits, unaware of your triggers, unaware of your patterns. It thrives when you live without examining your life. But as your awareness sharpens, the trap loses its structure. You begin noticing patterns in real time, the excuses you used to believe, the fears you used to obey, the distractions you used to indulge, the emotional impulses you used to follow. You see them clearly now, and because you see them, they no longer control you. Awareness strips them of their power. Another key transformation is the shift in how you view challenge. The 99% mindset sees challenge as something that disrupts life. But once your mindset evolves, challenge becomes a signal not of danger, but of relevance. When something challenges you, it means it matters. It means it is pushing you toward growth. It means you are stepping into territory that your old self avoided. Instead of shrinking under pressure, you start leaning into it. You begin to understand that the most important things in your life will often feel the most difficult at first. Challenge becomes a signpost, pointing directly toward your evolution. Another shift emerges in the way you process discomfort. When you lived in the average mindset, discomfort felt like a barrier, an inconvenience, a source of stress. But now, discomfort becomes familiar. You recognize it as the birthplace of change. You begin to feel strangely at home in difficult moments, not because they are easy, but because they are meaningful. Discomfort becomes a companion. It becomes a teacher. It becomes a mirror reflecting your level of growth. The 1% do not tolerate discomfort. They treasure it. And as you enter their mindset, you start to understand why. Another profound shift happens in the way you value your inner world. The 99% mindset traps people in external thinking, external approval, external success, external validation, external circumstances. But the elevated mind becomes internal, rooted in identity, values, clarity, discipline, and purpose. You begin realizing that the external world is a reflection of your internal world. And because of this, you prioritize inner alignment above outer performance. You stop chasing what looks good and start pursuing what feels right. This internal alignment becomes magnetic, drawing opportunities toward you instead of forcing you to chase them. As your mindset evolves, you also begin to recognize the power of emotional neutrality. The average thinker swings between highs and lows, excited one moment, discouraged the next. Motivated today, defeated tomorrow. Their emotional life resembles a storm, unpredictable and unstable. But the 1% cultivate neutrality, not coldness, but consistency. They remain grounded in both success and failure. They remain steady during pressure and calm during chaos. They move forward regardless of emotional weather. As you shift out of the average mindset, you begin developing this inner steadiness. You stop reacting impulsively to emotions. You begin responding with intention. This emotional stability is one of the clearest signs that you are no longer trapped. Another shift that emerges strongly is your changing relationship with identity-based excuses. The 99% often say things like, "That's just how I am," or "I'm not the type of person who," or "It's not in my nature." These statements feel like truth, but they are really cages. They prevent transformation by locking a person into their past. But as you adopt the 1% mindset, these excuses dissolve. You stop using identity as a shield. You stop allowing old labels to dictate your growth. You stop believing that your tendencies define your potential. You begin to see that identity is chosen, not inherited. This realization creates an inner freedom that average thinkers rarely experience. Another transformation is how you interpret opportunity. The 99% see opportunity as something rare, something that must be seized instantly, something dependent on luck. This creates a mentality of desperation and fear of missing out. But the elevated thinker sees opportunity as abundant. They understand that opportunity grows when they grow. They understand that opportunity multiplies when they are prepared. They understand that opportunity is attracted, not hunted. This mindset removes pressure. You no longer feel rushed. You no longer feel panicked. You no longer feel like chances are slipping away from you. You begin to trust the process. You begin to trust timing. You begin to trust yourself. Another shift is the way you relate to your past. When you lived inside the average mindset, your past felt heavy. You carried regrets, mistakes, wounds, insecurities, and disappointments like weights on your shoulders. You believed your past defined your future, but once you elevate your thinking, your relationship with the past changes completely. You stop seeing it as baggage and start seeing it as material. Your past becomes a source of wisdom. Your past becomes your reference point for growth. Your past becomes a reminder of how much you have evolved. Instead of feeling ashamed of it, you feel empowered by it. You recognize that everything you survived prepared you for who you are becoming. Another powerful transformation is your newfound intolerance for mental laziness. The 99% operate from convenience, not intention. They take the path of least resistance. They avoid the effort of deep thinking. But the 1% do not tolerate mental shortcuts. They think with precision. They question assumptions. They analyze their thoughts. They reflect with depth. They choose their beliefs carefully. And as your mindset elevates, you begin adopting this mental sharpness. You begin thinking deliberately instead of automatically. You begin seeing the world with clarity instead of distortion. You begin living consciously instead of unconsciously. This mental strength becomes one of your greatest advantages. Another shift emerges in how you approach success. The average mindset views success as an event, a single moment, a trophy, a milestone. But the elevated mind sees success as a process, a lifestyle, a system. They understand that success is built in the micro moments, in the discipline of early mornings, in the decisions most people avoid, in the habits repeated quietly. The 1% do not chase grand achievements. They build daily consistency. And once you understand this, success becomes predictable. It becomes manageable. It becomes inevitable. You stop hoping for it and start architecting it. Another transformation is the shift in how you handle uncertainty. When you lived with the 99% mindset, uncertainty created anxiety. You feared the unknown, avoided new paths, and hesitated at fresh opportunities. But once your mindset elevates, uncertainty becomes a space of possibility. You begin to enjoy not knowing. You begin to appreciate the flexibility. You begin to trust your ability to adapt. This mindset allows you to take leaps that average thinkers never attempt. It gives you courage. And courage is what builds the extraordinary life the 1% create. Another noticeable shift is your relationship with expectations. The 99% place unrealistic expectations on themselves and collapse when they cannot meet them. They oscillate between overcommitment and avoidance. But the 1% set standards, not expectations. Standards are internal. They are habits. They are identity-driven. They are consistent. They don't change with emotion or circumstance. When your mindset evolves, you stop chasing unrealistic bursts of perfection and start maintaining sustainable excellence. You stop trying to prove something and start embodying something. Another transformation as you break free from the trap is the rise of self-respect. When you lived with the average mindset, you may have broken promises to yourself, often skipping commitments, avoiding responsibilities, procrastinating, or settling for less. But once you elevate, you begin seeing each broken promise as a wound to your identity. You begin protecting your integrity fiercely. You begin honoring your word, especially when the commitment is to yourself. This deep respect for your own standards is what separates the 1% from the rest. And as this self-respect grows, so does your confidence. Another internal shift that emerges is the transformation of your relationship with discipline. In the past, discipline felt like restriction. It felt like force. It felt like something you needed motivation to execute. But once your mindset shifts, discipline becomes self-love. It becomes self-respect. It becomes your expression of commitment to the identity you're building. Discipline becomes a gift you give to your future self. This is one of the greatest unlocks of the 1% mindset. Discipline is not pain, it is protection. As you reach the final stage of escaping the 99% mindset trap, something powerful becomes clear. This transformation was never about becoming better than other people. It was about becoming better than the version of yourself that lived in survival mode, fear mode, and autopilot mode for far too long. Once you've elevated your thinking, you realize that the 99% mindset is not inherently wrong. It is simply unexamined. It is a mindset built from old programming, old habits, and old rules that no longer match the life you want to live. And once you see the trap for what it is, your evolution becomes irreversible. One of the deepest realizations at this stage is that average thinking is rarely intentional. People don't choose it, they drift into it. They inherit it from parents, cultures, environments, and experiences. They adopt it unconsciously. But the 1% mindset is always intentional. It is chosen. It is built through awareness, discipline, clarity, and courage. It is constructed brick by brick through thousands of small decisions, and you now see that each time you chose growth over comfort, responsibility over excuses, discipline over emotion, and purpose over distraction. You are laying the foundation of a mindset that separates you from the masses. Another profound shift is the sense of internal authority that emerges within you. The 99% rely heavily on external directions, seeking approval, validation, advice, or permission to make decisions. Their confidence depends on the opinions of others. But once you break the trap, you develop a sense of sovereignty over your life. You no longer need others to guide your direction. You respect wisdom, but you trust yourself. You listen to counsel, but you rely on your judgment. You value input, but you control the blueprint. This independence is not rebellion, it's maturity. It is the realization that no one is coming to live your life for you. It is yours alone. As your mindset elevates further, you also develop a different relationship with uncertainty. Before, uncertainty triggered hesitation. It created anxiety. It made you hold back. But now, uncertainty feels like a blank page. It feels like potential. It feels like creative space. You begin to understand that no great life is built on certainty, and no great story is written without risk. You accept that uncertainty isn't the enemy, is the birthplace of possibility. This acceptance dissolves fear and replaces it with curiosity, confidence, and adaptability. Another transformation that solidifies your exit from the 99%. Trap is the mastery of your internal dialogue. In the past, your mind worked against you more often than it worked for you. It amplified fear, exaggerated doubt, predicted failure, and magnified insecurity. But now, your mind becomes an ally. Your thoughts become tools. Your self-talk becomes strategic. You begin to speak to yourself in a way that reinforces your values, your identity, and your growth. You replace self-doubt with self-direction. You replace criticism with clarity. You replace uncertainty with grounded conviction. Your inner voice becomes your strength, not your sabotage. Another shift is how you begin to view the opinions of others. When you lived with the average mindset, criticism felt threatening. Judgment felt heavy. Disapproval felt personal. But as you elevate, you begin to understand that most people are not judging you. They're projecting their own fears, limitations, and insecurities. You begin to see that the loudest critics are usually the most average. People rarely criticize from above. They criticize from below. This awareness frees you. You stop bending your identity to fit opinions that hold no weight. You stop shrinking to remain acceptable. You begin living with a sense of authenticity that average thinkers rarely experience. Another transformation is the clarity you develop around direction. When trapped in the 99% mindset, your goals may have been blurry or borrowed, chasing things because others valued them, not because they mattered to you. But once you elevate, your goals sharpen. Your vision clarifies. You understand why you want what you want, not for applause, but for alignment. Not for validation, but for fulfillment. You begin setting goals that reflect your identity, your standards, your purpose, and your future self. And because your goals are aligned, the effort required to achieve them feels meaningful rather than exhausting. Another shift that becomes apparent is how you process setbacks. Before, setbacks felt like failures. They felt heavy, discouraging, and final. But now, setbacks feel temporary. They feel instructional. They feel like adjustments, not endings. You begin dissecting setbacks for lessons. You learn faster. You adapt quicker. You rise stronger. This resilience becomes part of your identity. You begin trusting yourself to recover from anything, not because you are perfect, but because you have built the inner strength to rebuild. Another transformation is your relationship with standards. When you lived with the 99% mindset, your standards may have been flexible, changing depending on your mood, environment, or circumstances. But once your mindset elevates, your standards become your foundation. You no longer allow the environment to dictate your behavior. You require the environment to rise to your identity. You no longer accept low-quality effort from yourself. You no longer accept weak boundaries. You no longer accept chaotic emotions. Your standards become non-negotiable. And this consistency creates a sense of dignity that average thinking cannot produce. Another internal shift occurs when you recognize that self-honesty is more valuable than self-comfort. The 99% often avoid the truth because the truth feels confrontational. They escape into distractions, excuses, denial, or blame. But the 1% seek truth even when it stings. They seek accuracy, not flattery. They seek clarity, not comfort. They seek growth, not ego protection. As you break from the trap, you begin telling yourself the truth, even when the truth is uncomfortable. You see your weaknesses clearly. You see your patterns honestly. You see your flaws objectively. And because you see them clearly, You can change them. Another powerful realization emerges. You no longer need life to be easy. You need it to be meaningful. The average mindset seeks ease, comfort, predictability, and simplicity. But the elevated mindset seeks purpose, challenge, expansion, and fulfillment. You begin preferring the path that strengthens you rather than the path that soothes you. You begin choosing long-term alignment over short-term pleasure. You begin valuing growth over convenience. And for the first time, you start feeling alive rather than just stable. Another shift that marks your exit from the 99%. Mindset trap is the way you think about possibilities. The average thinker needs evidence before believing. They need proof before pursuing. They need certainty before committing. But the elevated thinker operates from belief before evidence. They understand that belief creates action. Action creates momentum, and momentum creates evidence. They trust that their vision will gather proof along the way. This creates a psychological advantage, one that keeps them moving while the average mindset remains frozen. Another transformation arises in the way you approach change. The 99% see change as disruptive. They resist it. They fear it. They avoid it. But the 1% embrace change. They initiate it. They seek it. They use it as leverage. You begin understanding that change is the essence of progress, and resistance to change is resistance to growth. This acceptance makes you adaptable, resilient, and unstoppable in ways the average mindset cannot comprehend. Another shift is your relationship with regret. When you lived with the average mindset, regret was tied to mistakes you made or opportunities you missed. It felt heavy, personal, emotional. But once you elevate, regret becomes a motivator. You begin to fear the regret of inaction far more than the regret of trying and failing. You understand that failure fades with time, but regret compounds. This clarity pushes you forward. It makes you bold. It makes you decisive. It makes you committed to living fully, not cautiously. Another transformation is the rise of self-trust deep in your core. The 99% often question themselves, constantly doubting decisions, doubting abilities, doubting goals. But once your mindset evolves, you begin trusting your inner compass. You trust your discipline. You trust your resilience. You trust your intuition. You trust your ability to handle whatever comes next. This trust eliminates the need for constant reassurance. It eliminates emotional volatility. It eliminates self-sabotage. It becomes the stabilizing force behind all your actions. Finally, at this highest level of transformation, you realize the greatest truth of all. The 99% mindset trap didn't imprison your potential, it blinded you to it. Your potential was never gone. It was simply dormant, buried under layers of fear, self-doubt, inherited beliefs, and unexamined patterns. Now, those layers have fallen. The fog has lifted. The limits have dissolved. You no longer think like the 99%. You no longer live like the 99%. You no longer react like the 99%. You have crossed a psychological threshold. Point of no return where average thinking no longer makes sense. No longer feels comfortable, and no longer fits the person you have become. You now see the world differently. You see yourself differently. You see possibility differently. You are no longer trapped. You are awake. And chapter 1 ends here. With the understanding that escaping the average mindset is not the reward, it is the beginning, the doorway. The access point, the real journey begins with what you build next.